I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here this morning.
You know, this is a very special service, and I just want to take this moment. But before I begin, please allow me to center myself. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Lord, make me an instrument. Allow me to express your words on this man of God who came to us to share with us your wisdom and your love. But I'd like to give honor to God, who's the head of my life. The title of my talk today comes from the very last sermon of Dr. King, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. When I found that sermon, it took me into a wonderful study around this wonderful man of God. And I had to study it. And as I began to study it, I found it was much more than just a sermon. It was a theme about his life, his ministry. Sometimes you have to get to study a man's life to know about his ministry. He gave this sermon several times, and I began to realize that it was much more than a sermon. It was about chapters of his spiritual experience. When I first searched it, I discovered that he gave it at a commencement address at Morehouse College in 1959. And then I realized that he gave it again at Oberlin College in 1965, and he had adapted it and changed it. But the last time he gave it was in 1968. And I studied it each time. I began to realize that it was about the fact that throughout his spiritual experience here on this plane, during this time period of his revolutionary moments, he was always striving, trying to tell us that we have to remain awake through this great revolution that was taking place. And on each occasion, he told a story almost like a parable. And he began to tell that story based on a book from the Bible, from Revelations, 2 passages which he quoted. In the 16th chapter from Revelations, "Behold, I make all things new, and former things are passed away." And I had to dwell on that because the world was in that transforming aspects throughout his entire spiritual life for Dr. King. He wanted to talk about an old story that was written by Washington Irving entitled Rip Van Winkle, a story that I remember reading as a child. And he used that story for us to remember something. He takes us into this journey. He tells how Rip Van Winkle was asleep for 20 years. And he went up into the mountain for this long sleep. And you know, in Unity, we understand when you go to sleep in the mountain, you go up into higher consciousness. And when Rip Van Winkle went to sleep up in that mountainous area, and he slept for 20 years, he tells the story about how while he was asleep, And when he woke up, he remembered that while he was sleeping, that he had saw a sign before he went to sleep, and there on that sign was a picture of King George. And when he woke up, the sign had changed and there was a picture of George Washington. And then all of a sudden it dawned on him that there was a great revolution that had taken place. And now it dawned on him that he had slept through a revolution. And it took him into a moment of realizing that through all of these things, all the change that had took place, that he was no longer the man that he was, that the world had changed around him. So Rip Van Winkle's whole life had changed before him. So his title of his speech was Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. You see, the purpose of his talk was to remind us that we have to remain awake as a great revolution is going around us. He pointed out to those who was listening to him that don't be asleep as the world is changing around you. Don't be asleep as things are changing both scientifically or morally or educationally, because the world is changing before you. You can no longer be asleep. You have to pay attention. Even today, remember when Dr. King was speaking to those Morehouse students, he wanted them to understand back in 1959 that we were no longer going to stand there and be Negroes, that we were demanding our freedom to exist. He was telling them that they have to become awakened to the fact that America was changing before them, and they were going to step out into a world, and they had to declare themselves to be morally strong. He wanted them to realize that they can no longer just sit back and allow things to be done to them. He said one day we will have to stand before God of history, and we have to talk in terms of things we've done. Yes, we have to be able to build the world and build bridges to expand the seas. We have to hear God of history saying that that was not enough, but I was hungry and you fed me not. Dr. King was telling both those students and all those students who would listen that you can help shape the world, but don't be asleep during this great revolution. I can hear it now. I hear his words as he was talking to us in this very moment. Listen, let me close my ears and listen to me as we can hear the very words of Dr. King as he was speaking to the words to those Morehouse students, or to the students in the cathedral. In 1968, he gave his last speech. And at that moment, in 1968, he stood on the cathedral steps and he spoke these words so boldly and so proud as he talked about these things, about freedom.
Through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make of it a brotherhood. But somehow, in some way, we have got to do this. We must learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it is structured. The hour has come for everybody, for all of the institutions of the public sector and the private sector, to work to get rid of racism. And now if we are to do it, we must honestly admit certain things and get rid of certain myths that have constantly been disseminated all over our nation. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always ripe to do right.
Dr. King wanted us to remember that we have to remain awake through a great revolution. Dr. King wanted us to understand that somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. In that speech that he made there when he was talking about that ideas, there was riots that had taken place in Detroit and in Chicago and in Watts. He knew that without this hard work, we could not pull ourselves together. He knew that we had to work through all the challenges and changes. We must realize that Dr. King saw something, that if we did not remain awake, we could not change the world. Vietnam had made its challenging factors, forcing us to realize that we had to come together. He said that the hour has come for everybody, for all institutions of the public sectors and the private sectors to work together to get rid of racism. And that was bringing us together. Dr. King stood up because he knew that if we were to remain awake through this great revolution, the world had put a man on the moon. You see that right now he saw something so deep, and we were being challenged at the very foundation. The irony of all of this, at the same time, our nation failed to do anything for the black man through the act of Congress, was giving away millions of acres. We were being trapped in our own communities. We must come to see that the roots of racism was very deep in our own community. And even now, we can look forward to see how we have struggled. And even now, the pitfalls of what was taking place back then when Dr. King gave that speech. We fought and fought to make changes. Let me stop for a moment. Dr. King, when he made that speech, remaining awake through a great revolution, was causing waves and waves of challenges, because he took a moment to speak out against the Vietnam War. He spoke out not only against racism, but the injustice that was taking place all across America. But he was also caught up in another revolution, because he found himself being torn by the ideas that people did not believe in a nonviolent movement. Dr. King stayed strong to the idea of love, loving one another. As I look back, there was a great revolution remaining awake all over America. He stayed true to his word that we must love one another. Dr. King wanted us to be lifted up. You know, I never fully understood why he stayed strong to his truth. In many of our cities, we lost sight of the fact that while we were rioting in our cities, we were trying to tell Dr. King that we couldn't take it anymore. Many of us was raising our fists and hollering back and forth, hollering black power. But Dr. King was telling us that we have to love one another. He stayed true to the ideas of love and peace and nonviolence. And then he said these words that I will never forget in that same speech, remaining awake through a great revolution.
I say to you that our goal is freedom. And I believe we're going to get there, because however much she strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be as a people, our destiny is tied to the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of the history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were ever written, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of a most humiliating and oppressive conditions. And yet our bottomless vitality, they continued to grow and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face will surely fail. We're gonna win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so, however dark it is, however deep the angry feelings are, and however violent explosions are, I can still sing, we shall overcome. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie lives forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to the earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands a God, within the shadows keeping watch above his own. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair the stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Dr. King may not have known what those words meant to so many. Dr. King may not have realized how those words were going to feed a generation, how we knew that we had to remain awake through a great revolution. I must tell you this, after that speech was made at that cathedral in 1968, a few months later, in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a shot that was heard around the world. Dr. King was on a balcony, and he took a final breath as he was thinking about a speech the night before, when he says, I have been to the mountaintop. And he knew that he wanted to tell the world that I may not get there before. I may not get there with you. But an assassin's bullet took his last breath.
But it would be the last.
Many of us know what that night was.
Less than 24 hours later, at around 6 p.m.
for him, when he was too tired to even try to make that speech. Many of us understood that he, deep down inside, knew it was his last speech.
Nobel laureate.
But for some reason, he left a message for all of us to remain awake through a great revolution. Many of us understood that he foresaw something, because in his dream and his message to all of us, he told us to remain awake through a great revolution. I don't know if he knew what was to come behind him. I don't know if he knew that those who would follow him, that one day there would be a black president that would walk behind him. I don't know if he knew that somewhere along the way that he had carved and laid the foundation for a nation to rise up, to be lifted up. I don't know if he knew that from the very same church that he was in, that there will be a black senator that will be lifted up to help change the foundation of America. I don't know if he knew that one day there will be a young black woman who stood there as a little girl who will become the vice president of America. I don't know if he knew at that moment when he says, remain awake through a great revolution. But what I do know is that he was telling all of us to remain awake through a great revolution, because we can't go to sleep no more. That we have to understand that is our responsibility. You see, that day in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King understood one thing, that we can no longer go to sleep and be like Rip Van Winkle, that we have to be lifted up, because we saw that there's still an element in America. When they stormed the Capitol, there's still an element in America that want to keep us pinned down. There's still an element in America that want to keep us captured, embedded as slaves. But that's not going to happen, because Dr. King sacrificed his life so that we will remain awakened for a great revolution. Not a military revolution, but a spiritual and a moral revolution. A revolution of love, of peace. A revolution where we realize the God within us. A revolution that allows us to know is about an evolution, a spiritual evolution of the God within us, the Christ in you, your hope of glory. See, Dr. King understood that he may not get there, because what he did was pave the way for us to follow him to that mountaintop. His message, remaining awake through a great revolution, I understand it now. He said it so many times, he taught it and preached it, because it's always going on. And it will continue to go on as long as we follow that path, that spiritual evolution. There cannot be a revolution without the evolution of us expanding our conscious mind in the spiritual journey of our evolution into the Christ presence, the knowledge of knowing who we are, sent here to lift up all America. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, said it was for the soul of a nation. And he understood it, and he saw who we are in this revolution for America. Let us rise up and remember that we are the dream that Dr. King understood. So let us remain awake through this great revolution. God bless you.